Fantastic. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm afraid I can't join you this afternoon, so I apologise for that. It's a shame. There's some really good-looking papers on there. If anyone wants to get in touch afterwards, I'm happy for Adam to give my email address out. It would be good to chat with some of the people who are presenting this afternoon. So I want to talk a bit today about, we spoke about mayors earlier in Simon's paper. And I think what we forget is that in more recent times, in say within the last generation, we've only had mayors really in the sense we think of an elected mayor since 2000. We can go back to sort of powerful 19th century mayors such as Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham and so on. But the mayor of London still seems to be the archetypal figurehead mayor in the UK. So I want to talk a bit today from the perspective of political leadership studies as well, because mayors somewhat inevitably are often looked at from the point of view of local government studies. And I think actually there's a great deal of interest or interesting research to be done yet on looking at mayors as political leaders. Part of this is because, as I say, mayors have not traditionally been looked at from this perspective, and partly also because political leadership studies itself, and I'm a comparative political leadership analyst, but political leadership studies itself also has tended to look at sort of the central government, federal or executive level rather than at the local. So I think there's a lot of interdisciplinary exchange to happen there that could really develop some dynamic research agendas. So these are my aims. I think they were already in the abstract that I put for the paper. So they're fairly self-explanatory. Where my data came from, it's important to just quickly go over this. So this came from my PhD actually, which I did at Canterbury Christ Church University. And you can see my research question there was, can a strong mayor act according to their own will when constrained by the institutional limits of their office? So actually, this brings in bits of institutional theory, which again has been used to analyse mayors, but particularly thinking around the role of agency in leadership, which has been not monopolised by political leadership studies by any sense of that, but it certainly has been an issue that political leadership studies has got involved in defining what is individual agency in the face of institutional structures. My data was mixed methods. I used something called the Leadership Capital Index. It doesn't particularly need much to be gone into at the moment, but it was published first in 2015 by Mark Bannister, Ben Worthy and Paul Attart. And it created a 10 metric based system for analysing and quantifying and comparing leadership, and the idea that you have political capital and social capital. So there's this idea of leadership capital. In my PhD, I used that to compare and contrast. I won't use it today, but we'll touch upon elements, but I want to do a more discursive, qualitative look at these individuals. Probably the more important thing to raise here is that I looked at some polling, I looked at documentary evidence such as speeches, newspapers, policy reports and so on, and also 16 semi-structured interviews, 6 of which covered London and the others covered my other case studies of Michael Bloomberg in New York and Job Cohen in Amsterdam, who was an example of a appointed rather than elected mayor, and New York is another elected mayor. So just to recap, in the top right corner, there's a big debate at the moment, of course, about the ongoing use of City Hall. And this may soon become a historical artifact because City Hall may actually, in terms of the mayor's operation and the Greater London Authority, may all move to the Crystal in East London. Sadiq Khan seems quite keen on doing this because of saving money. There's a break clause in the lease. The lease currently runs to 2025. He may be even more keen on doing it yesterday. As you can see, it's made entirely out of glass and steel. It was rather unceremoniously called the Glass Gonad by Boris. But yesterday, Sadiq Khan probably felt particularly unhappy with it, given that the heating broke. And if you watched Mayor's Question Time yesterday, you would have seen him wearing a coat underneath his suit in order to keep warm. So the idea of the mayor introduced in 2004, Tony Travers has described it as a seething and chaotic system. This is not the mayor. and the Greater London Assembly, this is actually the situation, if you like, of London beforehand, which was run largely by something called the Government Office for London, which was a government level body overseeing a series of quangos that were running London. Thatcher or the Thatcher government had removed a London level tier of government, a whole city level of government, in 1986, which was the first time in about 150 years that London hadn't had a overarching region of government, level of government. There was this 14-year interregnum, and then, of course, when Livingstone is elected in 2000, he begins his speech famous, bearing in mind he'd been the leader of the GLA when it of the GLC when it had been abolished in 86. Livingstone stood up at his election as mayor, gave his first speech, and used the first words were, "As I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted 14 years ago." So there's a sense of institutional carryover for Livingstone. There is a phrase that we use called strong mayor, and some of you may be aware of this model. Basically, it indicates a mayor who is able to set a political vision, who's usually directly elected, is able to appoint, hire and fire their officials, and so on. That's versus the appointed mayor model. So, for instance, in Amsterdam, they have an appointed mayor, and the appointment actually comes from the Crown on the recommendation of the City Council. They're not allowed to set a political vision or a strategy, and their main responsibility is in safety and security. But they also have these sort of soft, informal areas of being, they use the phrase Bürgervater, which is about bringing the community together. So there are senses there in which a strong mayor also is supposed to bring the community together in London. But the idea that the mayor, when first introduced, and Sweeting wrote in 2002 from the point of view of local government studies, wrote that the mayor could potentially end up being weak because he or she was squeezed between central government and then the 32 London boroughs plus the City of London. There's also the issue of the Assembly, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Sweeting predicted in 2003 that future relations with central government would be characterised about mayors wanting to gain greater power, wanting to have greater influence, that mayors would not be satisfied with the settlement that they were given. The four key potential strengths of the Mayor of London are around the idea of legitimacy and profile. They've been directly elected, and relatively few political figures in the UK are directly elected still, and that gives them a great deal of attention. I'll come back to Boris and his ambitions later. The directly elected mandate is really important. They've got the largest directly elected mandate of any figure in the UK. Sadiq Khan currently has the largest directly elected mandate of any figure in modern UK history. In terms of the size of the electorate that has the potential to vote for them, the London mayor is the figure with the third largest electoral mandate in Western Europe after the President of France and the Prime Minister of Portugal. There's a sense of building consensus, this idea that though they may lack certain formal powers, they have a great deal of convening power running off the back of the elected mandate and the profile. And this sense of institutional stretch, sort of what Sweeting was hinting at this desire for further powers. And you see that, for instance, when Boris in 2008 makes the Met Commissioner's position untenable, and though the Met Commissioner was appointed and could be hired or fired by Jackie Smith as Home Secretary, in the end Ian Blair said that it was impossible for a Met Commissioner to continue without the confidence of the person who spoke for London, i.e. the London Mayor, and that in a sense was an expansion of Boris's power, even though it was technically illegitimate. No one was going to argue back against it because of the size of the mandate they would be arguing against. I've got the phrase Ken's Den. In one of my interviews, someone who'd been on the Assembly and is still on the Assembly, one of its few remaining original members, said that they were walking into the City Hall one day to go and work in their office. And as they walked there, one of the river cruise barges that go along the Thames was going past, and he heard someone on the loudspeaker point at City Hall and say, "There it is, that's Ken's Den." And that kind of signified what City Hall had become for lots of people. As the original mayoral holder in a vaguely defined position, Ken Livingstone was able to shape a great deal of what City Hall would go on to become. There's a sense in which I asked all my interviewees, did that distract him from being able to fulfill his agenda? And largely they suggested that it didn't actually stop him fulfilling his agenda. It actually gave him an opportunity to expand it and shape it in his image. And it was a positive use of agency rather than a distraction. In an interview in Peter, not with me, but at a conference I was at in 2017, Peter Mandelson described the setting up of the GLA as it was a fudge, in other words, highly ineffective. And it was largely created in order to stop Livingstone having any power were he to be elected. Of course, he was elected as an independent originally, and then readmitted to the Labour Party to run as their candidate in 2004 after they'd already selected a candidate. His original fights were on the public-private partnership for running the tube. This was about 3 large-scale franchise operations, basically, to run the tube services. And the government sort of hidebound Livingstone on that one because he took the government to court to try and remove them because he thought that they wouldn't be safe. He wanted the mayor to be responsible for safety and therefore publicly accountable rather than private corporations. The last of these PPP agreements went out of business in 2007 when Metronet went bust. But eventually the government won the fights prior to, obviously, 2007. They won the fights with legal challenges in 2002 and 2003. And again, it was an example of how government can hold local leaders, used one way or the other by hook or by crook, can hold power over them. They just refused to transfer full responsibility for transport for London to the mayor until the PPP disputes were resolved. So we think that the mayor is primarily concerned with transport. For the first 3 years, Ken Livingstone didn't particularly have the option to do all that he wanted in that sense either, though he goes on to successfully introduce the congestion charge. And that convinces government actually that he can get policy done, that he can lead policy, and that he would be the right person to run for as their candidate and be elected as the Labour candidate, for. Interesting points on personal leadership. Ken Livingstone was told by Trevor Phillips, who was Labour's desired candidate for the mayoralty in 2000, when the Assembly takes office, Phillips is appointed as its chair. He's elected as a member of the Assembly, and he tells Ken, you must not become a Kenocracy, and that they will hold him back if he does. Livingstone didn't disrespect the Assembly, but didn't particularly know what they were for. There are 25 members, 14 constituency members, and 11 list top-up members, who between them are representing 9.5 million people. And their only power with regards to the mayor is that they can overturn a budget or one of his strategies, but they have to have a 2/3 supermajority vote with an existing alternative proposal on the table. Given that it's a additional member system vote, obviously it's highly unlikely ever to get to a point where the parties can come together for a 2/3 majority. Livingstone famously redesigned City Hall. It was designed to be completely open plan, which means that every noise in it echoes everywhere. But he had offices inserted onto the 8th floor of City Hall because, quote unquote, I will want places for my advisors to plot and to scheme, which is part of his attitude, but also obviously part of his tongue-in-cheek way of doing it. He asked when he turned up, I interviewed the person who'd run his office, sent from government to run the office for him when he turned up, and he said, I understand I've been given a load of drongos and deadbeats. He thought he'd been dumped on by the people that central government didn't really want. But that eventually he actually came to embrace the staff, and he grew the staff. The staff were originally supposed to top out at 800. There were 1,200 members of the staff by the time he'd finished, because he realised he needed effective local government officers to get things done. And I'll come back to Ken maybe later on if there's time, but I'll just quickly at this point, a senior official in an interview with me said that, and I thought this was a telling quote, one at the bottom, that it's very much still the Ken Livingstone operating model. Livingstone's been out of the GLA in the mayoral position for 12 years and has had 2 successors, but both of them have largely kept, maybe with some adaptations, but have largely kept his model of running the GLA and the mayoralty. Boris comes along in 2008, of course, with a peculiar attitude about how to run things. He didn't actually know how to run City Hall. He hadn't done local government before, but he adopted quite cleverly how to deal with it by introducing a series of deputy mayors. Legislation allowed for a deputy mayor, but he realised that didn't mean that it had to only be one, and he eventually had 8. Khan's got 11. And by doing that, he enabled himself to have this institutional stretch. He placed other people onto the into positions where they could, into positions where, into positions where he could give them briefs. So he saw himself as a chairman of the board. I interviewed one of his deputy mayors. They said that it was a prime example. He used to sit there and he'd say, how many starts, which meant how many new houses are we building? So he saw himself as sort of a chair of a board of directors. He'd send them off to do things and bring them back in during the week on a Tuesday morning. He also adopted Ken Livingstone's model of going to the other parties' groupings on the assembly and talking to them, not operating within his own clique. You can argue for a Conservative mayor, this was important because the majority of the assembly was Labour. And for Ken Livingstone in his first term, none of the assembly members shared a party affiliation with him. But given the weakness of the assembly, it's not necessary for a mayor to do. And it was interesting that Boris chose to do that. There's also examples of course, where he's gone out and done things like great use of props and an imagery mayor, so appearing with the broom in the 2011 riots and so on. We can argue that Boris was less interested in what he could do for the mayoralty in terms of growing its powers, though he constantly asked central government for powers. And his one big transfer of powers over some of the royal parks regeneration areas. But he asked for things like transfer of all of schooling and didn't get that. The Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime was incorporated into the mayoralty and was a big increase. And Boris's current policing minister, Kit Malthouse, was his deputy mayor for policing. However, the issue there, of course, is that the mayor, this was just matched with national change in introducing policing and crime commissioners. So it wasn't a peculiarly Boris win for expansion of powers. He used the platform probably the most effectively out of any of the 3 mayors in terms of boosting personal profile and getting himself onto far more public media, big speeches, fronting up on the Olympics, doing a speech at the beginning of it. I was told in my interview, so I think it's fair to say because I put it in the PhD, the zip wire was a concocted incident. He didn't actually get stuck on the zip wire by accident. His advisors turned up an hour and a half before to make sure that would happen by giving a underestimation of his weight. And ensuring also that the media pen was directly under, just coincidentally, where he happened to stop. So things like that. But then in the last 18 months, he was determined to have a legacy. He was going around in City Hall saying that he realised he had no legacy. And he'd done a lot of things to raise his profile over things like Boris Island, but never really wanted to actually see that done. It was just again profile raising. He wanted to introduce Crossrail 2. That's still in the ongoing negotiations, but of course a part of that, it relates to the fact that Boris didn't actually realise that it would be passing under his own house. City Hall ended up sending him a letter that he had written to everyone who would be affected by this. And TfL in the last 18 months had a vast increase in their budget to do with marketing, and it was again about Boris trying to increase his profile. And getting involved in everything from to do with suicides on the tube through to saying about boosting of capacity and so on. And there is still a search to say, does Boris have a legacy in London? And if not, is the legacy really that it's about Boris, and the fact that he doesn't have one for London signifies how he used it? I'm steaming through a little bit because I know I'm running out of time, so I apologise, but I'll come back to questions at the end if I miss anything. I didn't cover Khan, and I haven't yet covered Khan, but I'm hoping to turn the PhD into a book, and he will be a case study I will add to the book. He's got a reputation in private with people I interviewed who mentioned him when I was doing my interviews on the other mayors, said about being less personable, and that the issue of agency has been held back for Khan, because though he's really taken a fight to a government that he clearly politically disagrees with, he has failed to cultivate relationships, even with his own deputy mayors. They often work away from the 8th floor, which is where he works, not because there's any suggestion of personality clashes, but just different leadership styles. But he has used crises well for his own profile boosting. So Brexit, saying that the London is open profile, talking about terrorism in a very powerful way as the first Muslim mayor of a Western capital city has been a particularly powerful point for him. And recently on COVID-19, and we saw yesterday about him arguing about the tier 2, tier 3 system. As I say, I know I'm rushing through, but I am happy to come back and talk about this at the end, but I just want to offer some initial conclusions. So I argue that Sweeting was proved right. The office has proved to be what holders choose to make of it. So there is significant latitude there for mayors to stretch and expand their role and their office power in the face of what was, and I believe still is, the longest piece of legislation, the 1999 Act. Since the Government of India Act in 1935, the legislation is over 700 pages long. But that actually meant that that fudge that Mandelson mentioned was achieved as a fudge, which meant that mayors were able to sort of treat it, if you like putty, and make it how they wished. One of my interviewees, who had been a significant figure earlier on in the Assembly, said that he believed he'd just recently done a review of the mayoralty for Khan. And he said that he actually believes mayors have not yet used the powers available to them to the full. But that there's potential there, and that informal stretching of agential power. Livingston's stamp remains on the Assembly. It's his template, and it's hard to see people differing from that. Why would someone want to cede greater authority to an Assembly that doesn't itself have power? And allowing for more deputy mayors, the expansion under Boris and Khan has allowed for the subtle expansions in power and responsibility, but has also allowed the mayor more time to do public profile work. And finally, I just want to quickly say what I said, that I would sum up with what this offers to a leadership studies approach and vice versa. I think leadership studies in local government, we often talk about contexts, constitutions and institutions, and individuals get absorbed within that. It's interesting to move out to a leadership studies approach that isn't necessarily automatically biographical. Again, lots of leadership studies is either obsessed with psychology or biography. I think they both have their place, but I think actually there's a sense in which leadership studies is a hybrid study of a whole host of different approaches, including the institutional and local government in this situation. It offers an opportunity for new avenues for research outside of local government studies and public administration, but still giving value to those. My theoretical framework in my PhD was drawn from Sweeting's work in local government studies. And it also allows to raise the profile of local, including in relation to the history. And in the front of my PhD, I gave the sort of immediate history to the prior to the GLA and the New York mayoralty and the Amsterdam mayoralty, because local leadership matches to issues of local identity, and that's often formed out of local cultural history. So I think there's room to expand and continue this work. If anyone wants to, I appreciate it's a bit of a barn through, but if anyone wants to get in touch and talk about development of these themes, and maybe in relation to their work or this work, I'm more than happy to chat about it, and I'm happy to take questions. What I'll probably do is stop the screen share and just go to a video, if that's okay, Adam.
Perfect. Thanks, Max. And thank you for the presentation and the talk in general. I think it's fascinating, particularly in the context of the upcoming mayoralty elections. Now, what I'm proposing to do, if you're happy with this, Max, and just to keep us on time with Josie in a second, is to move, if anyone has any questions, to move us into a breakout room and to have that in there. So we'll open that now. So it's a breakout room if anyone would like to head over and ask Max any questions, if that's okay. But thank you, Max. That was really.
How do I get into the breakout room? Sorry.
I think if you just go down to, there should be a breakout room option at the bottom. If not, we'll assign anyone who would like to.
Thank you very much.
Okay. At this point, if you're watching on YouTube, we're going to take a slight pause for a moment. So if you're on YouTube, we're going to stop.